we're going to take a look at a very neat trick here for blurring a background. Okay, because sometimes it's just not possible to do it in camera. If I wanted to really blur this background when I took the photo, I should have pulled them back, pulled them away from it more, and I could have used the depth of field to blur it, but it just wasn't possible. She was running all over the place, so you just gotta snap that photo when you can. But you can use Photoshop to help you give that to help you get that look that you were going for, where you have that really blurred background, a lot of depth of field here. We're gonna use a filter that a lot of people don't usually find. So the first thing I need to do is make a selection of them. I use the quick selection tool here, and it works really good. It takes about a minute or two. So what I'm going to do here is I just loaded the selection here. Just go to load selection and hit OK. So I had loaded a selection around them. Not perfect by any means. You can see here. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but mostly around the edge of their head and their shoulders and their body is where you want to look for. Now that I have that selection, what I want to do here is I want to blur everything else. So I'm going to go to select inverse, and then I'm going to press Command or Control J, and that's going to place the background up onto its own layer. And this is the layer that I'm going to blur in just a second here. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to tell Photoshop what we want to blur. The way we do that is with a gradient. You're going to see how this all comes together in a second. But I'm going to take the default black to white gradient here, okay, and I'm just going to drag it from about right near his hand. I'm going to drag it upward, and you're going to see it goes from black to white. Okay, so I'm going to drag it. I'm going to try dragging it again, and what's going to happen here is whatever is white is going to get blurred. Whatever is black is not. So I also, if I reduce the opacity of this gradient, you'll see that I want to blur the background here. Okay, so that's all going to be white. As it gets closer to them, I don't want to blur it as much because the depth of field won't be as pronounced as it would be back here. However, when it gets to the front of them, I want to start blurring again. So how can I do this? Really easy. Change your blend mode from normal, go down here to difference, and now just click and drag right at the bottom and see how I can add to that gradient. If I didn't have it on difference, it would have created an entirely new gradient. But now that I have it on difference, I'm able to add to this gradient here. So if we reduce the opacity, we'll see that right around this point, my blurring is going to be pretty much non-existent. As it gets forward, it's going to blur, and as it gets back, it's going to blur. Okay? It's a little bit weird to understand, but let's go ahead and copy this. Select all and copy. In order to use it, I need to have it in a channel. So I'm going to create myself a new channel in the channels palette and just paste it in there and deselect. Okay? That's called Alpha 3. So let's go back to the layers palette. We can hide that gradient. We don't need it. And let's go to our layer that we want to blur. Remember, this is the background layer. So all we're going to do here is come up to the filter menu. We're going to go down to blur, and we're going to use not Gaussian blur. We're going to use lens blur. Lens blur is a blur that's more representative of the type of blur you would get from a camera, where Gaussian blur is not really that kind of a blur, but lens blur is. Under my source, I'm going to change it to Alpha 3. Remember, that was the alpha channel that we created. And you'll start to see what happens here. Look at the blur. See how everything gets blurred in the background. As we get closer, it starts to remain more in focus, and then as it gets further toward the front, it starts to get blurred again. So everything on this plane that was black inside that gradient, everything right here is not being blurred, and that's what we're looking for, because that's the plane, that's the focal plane that they were on. We don't want to blur that. All right, and then under radius, you can come in here. You can make your blur even more pronounced if you want, or less pronounced. That's probably the most important setting in here, is the radius setting, and it's just going to control how much blur that you get. All right. At this point, I'm going to click OK. That's going to apply the lens blur filter to the photo, and when we're returned back over into our layers palette, you're going to see that we blurred the layer that's on top, but we didn't blur the people. Okay, and that's why we created that duplicate layer. Should be done, and there we go. Okay, so you see what happened here? Let's take a look. Here's before, and here's after. So we didn't blur the people. The one thing that you're going to see is probably a little bit of haloing around them, and that's easily fixable just by loading our selection. Let's go to select. Let's load the selection that I just created before. Okay, and then all we have to do on this layer right here is just hit the delete key. Just hit delete a couple of times, and what it does is it kind of removes any of that little haloing that we might have left around them just from not having necessarily a perfect selection. And then you can come in here and reduce the opacity if you want to try to get kind of a more subtle effect, because it's a little hard to ballpark exactly what it's going to look like till you get back to the layers palette. So you just reduce your opacity a little bit. Okay, you'll notice one area inside right here probably could use a little bit of blurring. I could go down to my original layer here, just take that blur tool, and just with a brush, just come inside of there and blur that a little bit too. Okay, you don't even need to use a filter for it. That blur brush does a pretty good job. All right, let's back out a little bit, and now again, let's look at our before image and then our after image. So it's a nice way to get an effect that's, you know, probably best to get in camera, but you can come into Photoshop and you can still do it after you've taken the photo. You just need to know which filter to go use. And what we want to do, and probably the biggest lesson here, is a lot of people go to Gaussian blur. If you take the extra time here, create this gradient for yourself, and you'll get a much more realistic type of a blur that you'd get from your camera if you use that lens blur filter.